Good afternoon from Washington, D.C. I'm Sharon with the Wilson Center's Asia program. For those of you who are logging into a Wilson Center event for the first time, a very warm welcome to you. The Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars was established in 1968 as an act of Congress, as a living memorial to the 28th President of the United States. It is staunchly nonpartisan, and it is a think tank that focuses primarily on foreign policy and aims to bridge the divide between the worlds of public policy and thought leadership. As the Deputy Director of Geoeconomics with the Asia program, I've been very fortunate to lead numerous discussions on issues of strategic interest to the United States across the Indo-Pacific, especially in Northeast Asia. But it is a tremendous privilege for me to be able to host today's discussion, which is the second of the Wilson Center's public events during Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month this year. And usually, I would say that the Wilson Center celebrates AAPI month, focusing on the rich cultural heritage and contributions made by Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders throughout the history of the United States. This year, however, our approach is quite different. To say that the pandemic has upended all of our lives would be an understatement. It's led to a great deal of social disruptions, and as well as racial reckoning across the United States. And of course, today marks the 1-year anniversary since the death of George Floyd and the ensuing groundswell of support for the Black Lives Matter movement. But the pandemic has also led to a seismic shift in the public consciousness of Asian Americans in the United States. All too often, Asian Americans have been touted as a model minority, and yet probably all Asian Americans have had some kind of painful experience in how they are perceived by others that stem from their physical appearance and cultural heritage. And meanwhile, the COVID outbreak has led to a surge of violence against Asian Americans across the United States. And a fortnight ago, the Wilson Center held a public forum about the correlation between the rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans and the rise of disinformation. Today, our conversation will look forward. We will focus on how greater awareness of long-standing and persistent racial discrimination and violence against AAPI could be addressed by public policy, and how, as well as whether there can be unity or common goals amongst the disparate Asian American Pacific Islander communities to come together as active stakeholders in the future of the United States. We've already seen an anti-hate crime legislation signed into law this month, but what more can be done? How and will the AAPI community come together further in addressing some of their common goals? I'm extremely excited to be able to introduce a stellar panel of experts and policy leaders for this discussion. The full bios of all the speakers is available on the Wilson Center's website, but let me introduce them briefly in the order that they will be speaking. We will first be joined by Representative Sharon Tomico Santos, a member of the Washington State House of Representatives. She will be followed by Karthik Ramakrishnan, Professor of Public Policy and Political Science at UC Riverside and a former Wilson Center Fellow. Following Karthik will be Linda Hasunima, Assistant Director of the Center for the Advancement of Teaching at Temple University. And finally, I would like to invite Abraham Kim, Executive Director at the Council of Korean Americans. After their initial comments, we'll have time for questions from the audience, and you can email us your questions at asia@wilsoncenter.org, or you can tweet us your questions at Asia Program. So with that, Representative Santos, the Zoom floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Shioko, for inviting me into the Wilson Center. Again, my name is Sharon Tomico Santos. I serve in the Washington State Legislature, where I am actually currently the longest serving Asian Pacific member of either house. I also serve as a member of the National Asian Pacific American Caucus of State Legislators and co-chair our special committee in anti-Asian bias and xenophobia, which was formed just over a year ago in the immediate aftermath of some of the rise in the hate crimes directed at Asian Pacific Americans. I'd like to talk a little bit about what my state has been focusing in on in this arena. And this is not a new subject. So I want to give just a little bit of context about what does Washington State look like in terms of our demographics. Of course, we are a West Coast state, and the West Coast is not at all unfamiliar with anti-Asian legislation, anti-Asian attitudes, and anti-Asian behavior. Washington State currently is about 10% Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander. That would be according to Karthik's organization did some work for our Commission on Asian Pacific American Affairs not long ago. And that was based on the 2015 intercensial data that was produced. But of those 10%, I think it is important to note that more than 90% of those come from 6 specific ethnic categories in order: Filipinos, Chinese, South Asian Indian, Korean, Vietnamese, and then Japanese. I also happen to represent the most diverse legislative district in the state of Washington that is about evenly divided until the next redistricting between Asian Pacific Americans, African Americans, white Americans. Currently, about 28.7% of my district is represented by Asian and Pacific Islanders, which is not surprising given that I represent the historic Chinatown International District with Nihon Machi, Little Saigon, and Manila Town. With respect to the work of the legislature, as I said, we are not unfamiliar with this. In fact, in 2019, prior to COVID, the legislature adopted legislation to create a working task force to identify and address reforms in the area of malicious harassment and hate crimes so that we can create a finer tuned identification about what is malicious harassment versus what is a crime. And why is that important? Because of course the legislature goes about defining what the penalties are for these different crimes. And so that working group came forward with its recommendations. In fact, during the 2020 legislative session and beyond, and we were able to act upon some of their recommendations. Perhaps most significantly is sort of the general areas in which the working group spoke to the need to raise awareness and enhance our responses to hate crimes and bias incidents. They categorized them in areas of law enforcement, in making sure that we're providing better training to our law enforcement officers around what constitutes a hate crime versus another type of attack on persons of color. We talked to prosecutors, and that has been a particularly important conversation because prosecutors are a little loath to prosecute hate crimes because of the question of how do you prove that this is a bias-motivated crime. But then it doesn't just stop with law enforcement. It is about making sure that we have remedial tools, restorative justice as a tool for response, both among law enforcement as well as the prosecutors and the courts, to repair the relationship between the law enforcement officers and our communities. largely immigrant. I don't need to remind our audience, but also that means that there are many language and cultural barriers to interacting with law enforcement officers, and a hesitancy to report crimes when they occur because of past history. I will also just note very quickly that work in the K-12 schools around ethnic studies and around the issue of teaching about bullying and hate and bias, as well as enforcing workplace opportunities. We understand through our work with the Special Committee on Anti-Asian Bias and Xenophobia that New Jersey, through their Attorney General's office, have been able to create an enforcement mechanism that private employers are able to use to require training and support for anti-Asian education. I think the thing that I would really like to focus on, as I know that my time is very limited and I want to hear what others have to say, is what do we do for the future? It is clearly important in all of those arenas that I've identified that policies be enacted that recognize the voice of Asian and Pacific Islanders. What I have to underscore more than anything else is that if our voices as Asian Pacific American actors are not part of the solution, then unfortunately we get glossed over in those solutions, and so that you get a generalized response. And what I mean by that is that it is insufficient to develop a response that is culturally competent in general, but not culturally responsive specifically to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians. And so how do we do that? One, again, I mentioned very briefly ethnic studies. We do have to begin with our youth. And believe me, our youth are leading the way. That's who is at the forefront of the Black Lives Matters. That is who is at the forefront of the anti-Asian hate fight back is our youth. And so how do we engage our youth and equip them with the civic engagement tools to use their voices in a productive fashion? It means that we have to, and so I'm so glad that Linda's on the line, we have to make sure that our teachers are prepared to be responsive to Asian Pacific Islander students. We also have to make sure that we have adequate disaggregated data. And I know this is a love of Karthik, having worked with him. And we, I think, are trying to lead the way so that we are no longer invisible to the masses of public policymakers. But let me end on this. While all of those pieces are critically important, they cannot take the place of having our voices in elected office and in those places where policies are made and policies are enforced. And so I started by saying I'm the longest serving Asian Pacific Islander in the legislature. I'm actually the longest serving member of color in the Washington State Legislature. But I take particular pride in my Asian Pacific American identity because we are, and I think, Shioko, you mentioned at the top that we are often portrayed as the model minority because we don't make waves, we don't speak up. And in fact, I think by advancing ethnic studies, one of the things that we will find out is we are not invisible. We have not been quiet through the ages, but it's a matter of our interaction with the majority culture and the majority peoples who want to put us in these preconceived silos. And so I really want to encourage anyone who's out there listening to consider a run for office. And if you are not considering a run for office, make sure that you are grooming other members of your Asian Pacific American community to run for office, because I'm certainly not going to be staying in the legislature for a long time. And I can tell you that as long as I've been here, when things started to move, was when we saw people of color comprising more than a third of the ruling party's caucus, where we were able to stop and forward legislation. And that's what we've needed all along, is true representation. So let me stop there, because I'm really anxious to hear from the others about other ideas, but even more anxious to get to the questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Representative Santos. Before I turn it over to Karthik, just let me thank you very much for your service. And I hope that it'll be many, many, many more years, decades even, before you decide to not serve the state of Washington any longer. And I hope you would actually also consider running for a national office as well. With that, Karthik, the representative has already cited your work a number of times today already. You've worked a great deal with the demographic data and how it pertains to AAPI. I'm hoping you'll be able to shed light on how the demographic shifts, as well as the shift in time, has led to an evolution in the power dynamics of Asian Americans.
Absolutely. Thank you, Shihoko, and to the Wilson Center. Representative Santos, just honored to be sharing the stage with you. And Shihoko, if I'm running a little bit long on time, just if you can send a signal, that'd be great. And it's a real honor and treat to be here. And I would say Washington State has been a leader when it comes to collecting detailed ethnicity data within different government systems. So, I'm the state of California, and California has the largest population of Asian Americans in the country, about 1/3 of the national population. But sometimes we get a little overconfident, right? We think we're the center of Asian America. And I remind colleagues, in addition to being the founder of AAPI Data, I chair the California Commission on Asian American and Pacific Islander Affairs now. And there's a lot that we can learn from Washington State and other states in which they've done some things before we have, and they still are ahead of us on some of these measures. So it's really important for there to be learning between the federal and state levels in both directions, as well as across states and localities. So I'll just give a bit more context. Just given the theme of this panel, I think it's really important for us to both acknowledge, the present moment that we're in and the challenges we face, but to see that larger picture, right, in terms of what our communities have been advocating for a long time. And we are not only defined by hate incidents. We have a much, much bigger and more comprehensive agenda. And what better time to do it than during Heritage Month to do this. I'll just say a little bit about AAPI data. But before I do that, I'll say I also run the Center for Social Innovation at UC Riverside. And there's a framework that we came up with about 3 years ago that has now informed our AAPI data work. So we say that we don't just do data. Of course, it's a big part of what we do. But our framework and our approach is what we call DNA. And this is something that we think a lot of nonprofits and others should be thinking about. And this framework is D for data, N for narrative, and A for action. So it's important to have systematic data for us to make a credible case to investors and policymakers, investors either in the public sector or in the private sector. So you need to have that systematic data, otherwise you will just be dismissed as someone who's peddling an anecdote. But data in and of itself is not meaningful, it's not memorable, so you need to have that narrative. And this is where community voice is so important. This is where community has such an important role to play, right? To convert that data into their stories and their needs and concerns. And it's important for investors and policymakers alike to treat that narrative very seriously. And then finally, all of that needs to be bound together in a call for strategic action. Right. So this is not a dissertation as someone is writing. Let's just go with where the evidence is, and who cares about what the recommendations are? No, we care about the recommendations, right? And so it's a very strategic way that we package together data and narrative so that we can move some kind of action. And there's so many actions that need to be moved, whether it comes to the underinvestment in our communities by philanthropy, or the lack. I mean, sometimes the advocacy is for better data, which then helps advance future advocacy. We have an amazing team at AAPI Data, so you can go to aapidata.com and see the wonderful folks we have. We have Professors Jennifer Lee and Janelle Wong and Sarah Sadwani. who are part of our team, as well as MyDo. We've had alumni of API Data who now work at the Pew Research Center as social scientists, and while it's painful to see them go, it's a big honor to see the kind of people we place coming out of API Data. And we do work nationally, right? Even though I'm based at the University of California, Riverside, other members are based in other parts of the country. And I would love to see how we can do more, both with this hat on as also with my commissioner and chair of that commission hat, to really build that, that state policy capacity and learning capacity. And because there's a lot that Washington, D.C. can learn from the various states. There are many data tools we have. We also do a lot of work with infographics and blog posts. And this is where we raise consciousness. For example, on undocumented immigrants, Asian Americans have had the fastest growth rate of the undocumented population. And within the Asian community, when you look at those groups, Indians, Filipinos, and Chinese, you'll have sizable undocumented populations. Many of them did not apply for DACA, for example, because of these flawed stereotypes and images we tell ourselves. I mean, it's not just the model minority man. Many people don't think the issue of undocumented immigration affects our communities. It absolutely affects our communities. So we would encourage people to update their narratives about the Asian population. This is also true with respect to national origin. You still have this mold where people equate, and there's research that Professor Jennifer Lee and I have done, where we have survey data that show that people tend to equate Asian with East Asian. But we know that we've had diversity for a long time, especially after the refugee crisis in the 1970s, and then with South Asian immigration over the last 2 decades. And in fact, if you look at the largest single national origin, largest single Asian origin group in the country, as of 2019, it was Indians and not Chinese. So that is a major shift in terms of who Asians are. But unfortunately, our popular narratives don't acknowledge what a lot of people, Filipinos and South Asians, call brown Asians, right? And there actually is a hashtag that says brown Asians exist, because people sometimes make that equation of yellow as Asian, and I'm not yellow, right? And so many Asian Americans are not yellow. It's also important to pay attention to Pacific Islanders, which is actually a separate racial category, starting with the 2000 census. So it's really important for us it's great to see the level of attention and concern about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, but we would invite people to take a closer look. We also have a tool called Census Maps, if you go to our site, and that's not using the latest census data by race will not be available until August and September in 2 different tranches of data that come out. But we're using the 2019 5-year ACS file, and you can go to the top 20 metropolitan areas for Asian Americans and also for Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, and just drill down. We believe that data needs to be accessible, and also we believe that data can be beautiful. And so that is one of those instances we would encourage you to test it out and let us know what you think. We always love feedback from our users, and our users range from journalists to government agency folks to just everyday folks. We see our slides and infographics in the wild from time to time when people tweet about it. It's interesting. Sometimes people ask us permission. Can we use this graphic? And we're like, of course, this is there for you to use. We want you to use it. You don't need to tell us about it, but if it's been helpful, let us know. Maybe I'll leave it there. The final thing I'll say is we have so much diversity in our community that people think that maybe there is no such thing as Asian American. You have all of this diversity. How can you say that this is one group? And this is where research comes in handy. You have to collect detailed origin data to know what are the circumstances in which the group is unified and what are the circumstances in which they're divided, right? So when you look at educational attainment, vast variation there. When you look at poverty rates, when you look at English proficiency, even a lot of health outcomes, you have major differences. And that's why it's important to disaggregate or have detailed data collection. But when you look at a lot of public opinion, so this is data we've been collecting since 2008 on issues like expanding healthcare, expanding the social safety net, gun control, environmental protection, immigrant rights. On so many of these issues, you see a remarkable degree of convergence. I say remarkable because you have so much diversity by socioeconomic class in this population. To see that level of convergence is truly spectacular. And this is also true of some folks that may be Republican leaning, right? Vietnamese Americans, Republican leaning, they support universal healthcare, right? And so this, we really need to be evidence-based and evidence-driven and not stereotype-based and stereotype-driven in terms of who our communities are. So I'll leave it at that, Chihoko, and happy to talk more in the Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Karthik, for those very insightful comments. I'm going to now turn to Linda. Karthik has talked about convergence of interests. One of the convergences we can also see is from women. I'm hoping you could address women and AAPI and the way forward for female unity or solidarity.
Thank you, Shioko. And thank you to the Wilson Center for including me on this panel with people I deeply respect for their work and contributions. What I would like to share with you all today are some thoughts I have about gender and these issues and the way forward. And the Atlanta shootings brought to light realities in our community that may have been hidden from mainstream America, but that we as members of these communities knew and discussed privately within our families and circles. So the tragic targeting and killing of these women forced not only the AAPI community, but the country to face the fact that we have great inequalities and poverty among our diverse community, and that stereotypes and sexualization of Asian women have grave consequences, that these women were targeted, attacked, and killed because of ideas of who we are. So we're starting to see more open and public conversations about women and the more vulnerable members of our community than ever before. The increasing anti-Asian hate and violence has disproportionately impacted women. And we see that from the Stop AAPI hate data. And so I think that because of what happened in Atlanta, we understand now that there are many members of our community that are working in industries and professions where they are taking risks. They are in public and working in jobs that don't necessarily provide a safety net. A couple of the women that were killed were in their 60s. They're not preparing to retire. They are still working very long hours to support themselves and their families. So women who ordinarily would remain on the margins and be invisible to us became very visible nationally, internationally. And this was really a convergence of, gun policies and gun violence, the way in which Asians and Asian women are diminished in our society because of stereotyping, the sexualization of women, plus the intensifying rhetoric and scapegoating of our community during this pandemic. And we were seeing in the victims of these crimes the faces of our sisters, mothers, right, grandmothers, daughters. And I think that this has really inspired and moved us to take action, especially after months after George Floyd's murder. Asian Americans were already being mobilized and standing up and protesting. And I think that, Atlanta is also a very important moment that has inspired us to speak up, challenge, disrupt, protest, organize, and work together. And in this important moment, it's heartening to see more awareness and concern for our community at all levels of government, but we need more and we need to push for more. Just as the Representative Santos was saying, we have momentum and we need to build on it right now. And so I see this especially in the areas of education and health. And I wanted to just remind everyone to, include a gender lens as we evaluate the impact of the pandemic on women across different groups in our community. And I really believe that through the pandemic, we've learned more about how important it is to have access to healthcare. A lot of our community, they face language barriers and need additional support and access to correct information about health services and what's going on with COVID and vaccinations. I also think that curricular changes are really important. And you can do this at the state level, but in addition to that, because that takes time, that's political, and you need resources, I think you can go directly to educators. We have so many resources online. There are, all sorts of syllabi available to you from K through 12 and above. So I think that that is one kind of short-term way that we can build on this momentum, is try to promote more inclusive education, bring in our stories, our contributions into the classroom. I think this will do a lot to help fight some of these stereotypes and very limited representations of our community. I also think that this is an opportunity to reflect on areas of solidarity and coalition building across different groups. And scholars have shown that this will be a major challenge because Asian Americans come from 24 countries. Most of this I've learned from Karthik's data resources, from 2 different countries, speak multiple languages, have different religions. And because of the specific context in which they migrated here, we don't necessarily share the same ideas about politics, parties, and politicians. And we don't necessarily, automatically support one party over the other. It really depends on so many different conditions. So I think because we're so diverse and complex and include multiple generations, from those who have had families here since, the 1800s, maybe have had family members that were interned, to those that escaped political regimes and war during and since the Cold War, to more recent arrivals, you can't really generalize us. And that's where I see that we don't, as a group, even know our own histories, and that we need education for ourselves as well. As Karthik was saying, we don't understand that the Southeast Asian and South Asian members of our community and their experiences. So we need much more education as well about our diversity. I think that what can unify us is this data that Karthik was talking about, because the more data that we have, the AAPI data and the Stop AAPI Hate data is what helped us to get some of these changes. I guess my question is, moving forward, what's missing? What's not being talked about here? Where can we learn more about the needs of our community in terms of the elderly, healthcare? What about women's issues, domestic violence? Where can we dig in and really see where we can work together? I also wanted to end by highlighting the dedication of local groups, associations and organizations, activists, many of them feminist activists. Many of these are also faith organizations in our communities who were doing this work well before the pandemic, quietly serving and supporting our communities, but have really stepped up and been quite heroic during the pandemic to provide relief and services that sometimes weren't coming, when they were needed. And so I think that targeting economic efforts to help a lot of these family-owned businesses that were devastated during the pandemic, looking at the lessons learned in terms of access to healthcare and looking at education are really key as a way to combat the anti-Asian bias and violence that we are seeing right now. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. You've given us a lot to work with there. Abe, so as the head of the Council of Korean Americans, you're a leading advocate for empowering Korean Americans and raising their voice on local, regional, national, on the national stage as well. So what impact has the pandemic had on CKA's efforts, and has it really garnered more support to mobilize, raise the voices of Korean Americans, and how does that differentiate from the other AAPI communities in the United States?
Well, first of all, thank you for this opportunity to join this distinguished panel. And the challenge of going after just 3 marvelous speakers is to try to figure out something new, because I was saying, yes, absolutely, go for it. Amen, amen. Every time all of our speakers are speaking, because that's all the things, everything from education to importance of data to advocacy, as well as the importance of history and learning our own history is all of these dynamics that are occurring within our own community. CKA, or the Council of Korean American, we're for those of you not familiar with this organization, we're a national organization that represents leaders of Korean American descent of both public and private sector. And our main purpose is to amplify the voice of the Korean American community and the Asian American community more broadly, but also invest in today and tomorrow's leaders in terms of being better Americans, serving and giving back. And so we have, over the last 18 months, it's just been, I would say it's been a very eye-opening experience as a civic leader, watching all the different changes that have occurred. And what I mean specifically is, one is actually some of the things that have already been shared is a greater self-awareness of what it means to be Asian American. I think what we find out, many of us found out, is that yes, we've grown up in the immigrant experience, but we don't know our own history, right? And the relationship among our different communities. So I think there's been a greater awareness among leaders to learn about their own history, how that intersects with other racial groups, the civil rights movement, and the long history of how underrepresented communities have been working together. Sometimes they haven't been fighting together, and sometimes, but ultimately building for a stronger United States. And I think that's been a great foundation in many ways to start to think about. I mean, the term allyship never really was spoken much about prior to 18 months ago, quite frankly, within our community. But now it's an important topic of discussion. How do we work with other communities? How do we work with our, as many of you know, the Korean Black relationship has been very tense over the years. And that's one issue that through this moment in time, where could we change the narrative on Asian American and Black African American relationships through this process. And so a lot of these important conversations are emerging, and these moments of change gives an opportunity for us to change our community as well. So that's one. And secondly, this whole awareness of data and the importance of data and the importance of disaggregation of data, I think is something that I think our community is taking on very seriously. And I think I'm preaching to the choir in terms of the importance of that, because without data, like Karthik said, we don't have a strong ground to stand on, right? And so those are the important, not only the data, but also the nuances of our community. And so those are some of the important areas that have been that our community has awakened to. And also, I think for this opportunity of not only heightened racial tensions, but also there have been structural inequities within not only our society, but also in industry, for example, as well as I work with a lot of leaders. And as all of us know, that Asian Americans are underrepresented at leadership roles, at public boards, as well as in C-suites. And it's not only public service leadership that's important, but also industry leadership, hand in hand, and we need to work together. And those are some areas that needs to be addressed, but not only industry, but also leadership in academia, leadership in civil society, in all these leadership roles. Asian American Pacific Islanders have tremendous amount of innovation and talent and to offer mainstream America. And I think this may be a moment where we can start to address some of those structural issues that have been have been holding the community back in terms of these leadership roles. And then finally, I think just that ultimately, I think what has happened also is some of the, I guess I'll end with this, is that we haven't talked a lot about mental health too. And as you know, from the Asian American community, mental health has had some stigmatism around it. We don't talk about mental health, a lot of us, a lot of our families. But I think what COVID has taught us, as well as the racial tensions across the country, is that we are all suffering together in some capacity. And we need to bring these important conversations to the fore, to have these conversations and help each other and provide safe space for our community to talk about these things. And so those are some of the hard issues that as a community and other communities we are aware of that we're having conversation are trying to tackle during this period. So with that, I'll pause and I'll happy to hand the table over back to you, Shahoka.
Great. Thanks so much, Abe. So just a reminder to those who are watching this online, we are taking questions. You can email us at asia@wilsoncenter.org, or you can tweet us at Asia Program. Again, the email is asia@wilsoncenter.org, and tweet us at Asia Program. I actually want to ask two questions. One is sort of delving in a little bit more about the generational divide that we see. Representative Santos and others have talked about some of the challenges of the AAPI communities in understanding and communicating the cultural barriers. Of course, that dissipates with each ongoing generation. How has the generational divide materialized or been accentuated over this rise of the Stop Asia hate movement? Has it made an impact? Has it made it better? Has it made it worse?
So yeah, I'll jump on this. And one thing I should know is we've done a quick rapid response survey with SurveyMonkey. We started the day after the Atlanta killings. And we were very keen to do that because we wanted to try to collect systematic data on our community. One thing I should say, whenever possible, we try to do language support, but just given the interest of time, and there is no online panel that has Asian language support, we went with SurveyMonkey sample, and it was a great collaboration between our teams. We always believe that we should not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And so whenever we can advance data collections, we should. So that data tended to have more of a native-born sample, but we had a lot of foreign-born in there as well. Important thing, when you collect this data, a lot of the things that we see based on social media viral videos or even news coverage, and I would say even on community hotlines, what they represent are people, say the community hotlines like Stop AAPI Hate, they represent who is aware and who has been calling those hotlines. So there is a gender disparity, for example, that comes through those hotlines. There is not a gender disparity in our data. So that means that Asian men are also facing many of these acts. Of course, it plays out in different ways. It's not to say that gender doesn't matter. Similarly, I'll say on generation, most of the videos we've seen is of elderly Asian women. Well, guess what? Native-born and younger Asians actually have higher incidence of hate. This is so important because I'll go back to narrative. And especially in a world in which you have self-reinforcing mechanisms about how news cycles work and how social media imagery and videos work. We selectively look at that, right? There's also some of these social media footage that portray a very distorted photo of who the perpetrators are. You might think that it's urban Black men that are the large perpetrators, but no, you have a recent study, and that's looking at news coverage, which itself is very, very partial, which shows that the vast majority of perpetrators are white men. So I just say all of this to say that we are actually in the only early stages of awareness of what is going on. And instead of just resting content with what is out there already, what this means is we need to engage the younger generation, native-born folks. What I will say is when it comes to the galvanizing moment, it is very remarkable, right? How this has brought our communities together. But from what Linda said about the solidarity work with other communities of color, that is so important. So our data, we were so fortunate with SurveyMonkey, in which we not only were able to do this study of Asian Americans, we also did it of Pacific Islanders and other communities of color. So yes, when it comes to microaggressions and other othering behavior, like being asked where you're from, right? Asian Americans are most vulnerable. But if you talk about being stopped and searched by police, unfairly stopped and searched by police, it's Asian Americans are among the lowest, and Black folks and Pacific Islanders have higher levels. It is just so important for us to do that systematic data collection, and then also to drill down who are those Asian Americans that are being affected. And a lot of them are native-born and younger. So we have to pay attention to these folks.
Well,
Abe, I
maybe I'll
think
just,
yeah. Oh, yes, please.
so thank you, Karthik, for saying, for particularly acknowledging the importance of self-awareness. If we only pursue what we're interested in, sometimes we predefine what the problem solution is going to be, or what we anticipate we are going to see the problem will be. I guess one of the things I would like to also insert into this, and Shioko, I think you sort of gently pushed us in this direction, which is there is an issue of power that we're not dealing with. Linda asked the question of, so what's missing? The head-on conversation about who's wielding the power, whether it's the power of the information gathering, whether it's the power of the information sharing, whether it's the power of who is actually, I mean, I think we can all identify the sort of more universally accepted notions of power, of whether you're a member of law enforcement, or if you're a politician, or that sort of thing. But again, the male-female power issue is a very important thing. I'm so glad that Linda talked about the gender differentiation, because one of our community-based organizations that has been front and center around this issue, specifically around the genderization of violence and racism, is the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, which I'm very proud to have served as a founding sister of. It is an important conversation that has to take place in our own communities, where male power is really an important barrier to overcome, because and not just because it means that women, or that men hold power over women, but it also presumes that men have a vulnerability in sharing information when they've been attacked. And so there's this sort of reticence to come forward, that they're not able to say, I am a victim. And that is a disservice as well to our community. And when you talk about the generational gap, that is, I think, a very interesting aspect to explore. Speaking as the daughter of an immigrant, and I suspect that many of you share this experience, there's an interesting line that you cross, and you don't know when it's going to come, when all of a sudden the immigrant parent is no longer the person on whom you depend, but on who depend upon you. And that generational gap, so there's the age generation, but there's also the immigrant status generation. And for myself, those two combined, but that's not always true in all of our communities. And so I will come back to the notion that representation matters. When we had the first refugee Asian member of the state legislature join our caucus, that made a difference. Her voice made a difference. When we had the first South Asian Sikh join our legislature, that made a difference. Because again, going back to the notion of what's the narrative also has to be authentic. It has to come from community. And I'm not a South Asian Sikh. And until I had a colleague who actually bore authentic voice to that narrative, I could also be dismissed by my colleagues, even though, because there was nobody else. So I want to end on that notion that representation truly matters. And if you are not the member of the group that you're trying to represent, it's important that you work with organizations like Abraham's to reach out to those genuine communities and bring them into the fold somehow.
Thank you. Linda.
Oh, I just wanted to add that I wanted to first address Karthik's clarification on the data and versus the perception and the images that are shared on social media, right, that distort how we understand this. And what's very troubling is that those images of more elderly women being attacked by Black perpetrators, you also see that shared in the global news, right? And that kind of feeds into these tensions, when the reality is that it's mostly white perpetrators, right? So I just wanted to address that that has a global impact on this as well. And that for the community level and women's leadership, I just also wanted to highlight that there's so many young women in the community. Like I see this in Philly with the Chinatown community there. They had a like a wellness week and all these mental health programmings for women, children, families. There's just so much activity and leadership being demonstrated at these levels. And I think that these community associations and organizations are great places for more political and voter education, that they are very effective mobilizers too. And I feel like this is where we need to go to see what the needs are. And to get the narratives that Karthik was talking about. So I just wanted to add that point about young women's leadership in particular at the local levels.
Yeah, in terms of the generational divide, from what I've seen is, well, sometimes these images that Karthik well, they feed into fear, right? And as we talked about allyship and solidarity, sometimes those, when leaders are working for the purpose of building bridges, some of these media images start to, unravel our efforts. And so it's been a challenge, and those tough conversations have come up as we're talking with other communities as well. And so this notion of creating wedges between communities has been an issue, and particularly because of the Asian culture and the relationship among parents and children and so forth. There's been a deep sense of fear within the community as well, and I can't tell you how many times in terms of our own conversations with our leaders saying, our parents are fearing even going to the park and to the store and things like that. And so there's this, for the first time, there's this, well, not for the first time, but there's this generational concern that has developed over the last 12 months as well, I think, within our own community. But on a positive side, what's really been encouraging for us has been our young people have been more energized than ever before. I think a lot of our not only our teenagers, high schoolers, and college students have been very energized and really wanting to be a part of the solution, and actually in some ways being a role model for us middle-aged folks in terms of getting and tackling the issues related to structural racism and taking on issues related to civil rights and things like that. And so I think there have been some fear, but there's also been some tremendous positive energy that has been unleashed within our young people. And I hope that continues, and they continue to fill the gaps that we were unable to accomplish when we were young people. So just some observations from the community. So.
Great, thank you. So we only have about 5 minutes left, but let me pose a more uncomfortable question. That is to say, there are critics, of course, of this general wokeness of the younger generation, that the conversation has gone too much into the extreme, and that the coastal areas are much more race conscious, much more focused on social justice and equity, and other parts of the country are not necessarily as comfortable. Is that an accurate picture? I'm kind of looking at Carthage on the Zoom screen right now. Is that an accurate painting of the reality within the United States, that certain pockets of the United States are seen much more hostile, uncomfortable for minorities, therefore they're going to be less willing to go, and the cycle kind of feeds upon itself? Or is this simply yet another kind of media image that doesn't necessarily reflect reality?
You know, it's interesting. We, a couple of things. Wow, there's so many questions embedded in that. That you just threw it out there, Shayoko. One thing I'll say is, you know, even something like coastal and inland, or red state and blue state, you know, a lot of times it's between cities, certain types of suburbs, and more rural areas where you will see some of this differentiation. But what's interesting is that when we, in 2008, when we did a survey in terms of experiences with discrimination, as well as 2016, other scholars have tried to look at the difference of population density and you know, proportion of people of color, and whether that makes a difference. They generally have not found that it makes that much of a difference. So another way to say that is, being Asian in this country, being a non-white person, you know, exposes you to risk in similar ways in different places. It's probably the way that it exposes you to risk is different. And that's the thing I would say. For someone who may be more conservative and says, you know, we're talking about people policing themselves and thought police, you know, think about this. Like, when we are not inclusive, we do not benefit from the full talent and experiences that people have to offer, right? In Berkeley, there's an institute called the Othering and Belonging Institute. We need an America in which everyone feels like they belong, because otherwise we are not going to be able to tap the full talent of what America represents. And so that would be a kind of business case, or even a more conservative case, for why everyone should care, right? This is not just a liberal issue or a democratic issue.
And I know we only have 3 minutes now, but I would be remiss if we didn't go back to the mandate of the Wilson Center, which of course is to focus on foreign policy. And Linda actually talked about the global impact of some of the imagery that we're seeing from the racial tensions. Certainly the Chinese have thrown the racial tensions that are going on in the United States, thrown it back to the United States, saying that US criticism of the United States about China's violation of human rights, etc., does not really stand on firm footing, because the United States is hardly the beacon of equality and democracy itself. How has this actually impacted US relations with South Korea, with India, with Japan? One sentence or two from each of you, if I may.
I'll start us off. I believe that based off of conversations I've had, and also from looking at Twitter at these hashtags, it has definitely hurt our image and stature in the international community, and the fact that we have these issues with racism and cannot protect our own people from these acts of violence, I think has really hurt our credibility and authority and reputation. And that younger people and the folks that I've talked to in South Korea, they do see a shift. There is more criticism and questioning.
So quick thing, I'll say a couple of things. One, you know, it's with India and South Asia, but especially in India, you know, it's actually been a kind of different dynamic where you have a lot of Indian Americans, including second generation, with COVID and the devastating impacts. So there has been a different kind of transnational concern and conversation going on. The thing I'll also say is that it's also important to note that there have been other Asians who have been attacked before, including South Asians and especially Sikhs, you know, in the 2 decades since 9/11. And when Srinivas Kuchibhotla got killed a few years ago, that caused major concern in India about the fate of immigrants and especially tech workers in the United States. Finally, I'll just say, for me, when it comes to, and this is not as much about foreign policy, but Pan-Asian solidarity, Japanese Americans and the Japanese American Citizens League has just been so exemplary in consistently showing up when any Asian group and actually any group's human rights are being violated. And I think that is something we should all aspire to make sure that we don't just show up. And there are people like Manju Kulkarni, who's a South Asian woman, who's one of the co-founders of Stop API Hate in this more kind of anti-East Asian moment that we face now. So that's something I would say I'm hopeful for, that we are not bound by our national origins and that we can show up for each other in many ways.
I'll just mention a quick one sentence. I agree with everyone in terms of, I think it's both, it has hurt us because of the rise in anti-Asian American sentiment and the concern of the safety of the United States and our immigrants coming here. But also it's been a question of also an opportunity for conversations because of, as Karthik mentioned, seeing a lot of Asian Americans showing up and supporting the Black community and other communities, and that's not familiar with a lot of Asian countries, and the solidarity, and so in many ways it's really highlighted the importance and the foundation of American democracy, but also it's also created some tension as well. So I'll just leave it there.
I guess the one thing I will say is I think that it raises levels of concern in international affairs, especially in the Pacific Asia region, on two levels. One, we cannot sit here and not acknowledge that there are tensions in and among the various countries of the Asia Pacific, and that they play against one another. And so to the extent that in the United States, we as Asian Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian Americans are representative of the melting pot of America. I think are the homes of our ancestors, however far beyond we've come, do not fully understand and appreciate, are you them or are you us? Just like Americans don't fully understand, are you them or are you us? And so I think the question that the larger population needs to appreciate and help us work through is, if we are truly American and fully in our great diversity, then America has to, as I think Karthik indicated earlier, be fully welcoming and assuring of the belonging of people who have our faces, we cannot change our faces, as full Americans, because even the international countries don't understand or and would like to know. And so I think we can be used as a pawn both in the domestic politics as well as in the international politics, and we don't want that.
Great. Well, with that, we've come to the end of our hour. I want to thank you, all of our panelists, for joining us today for a very rich discussion. And I would also like to thank all of you watching this online for joining us in today's conversation. I know that we've only scratched the surface of the issues related to the AAPI community, but I do hope that we can gather again for next year's AAPI Heritage Month and hopefully discuss how much progress even further we've made over the last 12 months. So with that, I also want to thank my colleagues of the Korea Center, Jean Lee, and intern John Ming Lee in particular for helping to organize this event. So thank you and hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.